This is the Moonlight Scholar, a place for quiet stories of science, history, and the mysterious corners in between. Tonight, we begin a journey into the beginnings of archaeology, the study of the human past through the objects, structures, and traces that people have left behind. But before we dig into ancient ruins, let's pause and consider the word itself: archaeology. Today it suggests careful excavation, cataloguing, and interpretation. It evokes images of stratigraphy, of tiny fragments arranged in neat sequences, of inscriptions painstakingly deciphered. Yet this has not always been the case. For much of human history, people have engaged with the past in ways that were curious, creative, and sometimes destructive, from early collectors and tomb explorers to imperial expeditions that moved entire monuments across continents. Archaeology, as we understand it, is the product of centuries of curiosity, discovery, and evolving method. Tonight, we will trace these origins. We will explore how humans first imagined their past, how objects were collected, cities excavated, and methods developed. From ancient precursors to the first scientific practices, we will see how the discipline emerged, shaped by wonder, ambition, and a growing desire to understand, not just possess, the past. Before we begin, take a moment to settle into your space. Lie back or sit comfortably, letting your body feel supported. Close your eyes if you like, and take a slow, deep breath in, and let it out gently. Feel the weight of your body pressing into the surface beneath you. With every exhale, allow your muscles to soften, your shoulders to relax, your jaw to unclench. Notice any tension in your legs, arms, or back, and let it drift away like dust from an ancient ruin. Now, bring your attention to your breath. Inhale slowly, filling your lungs completely, then exhale evenly, releasing all lingering stress. Imagine each breath as a gentle rhythm, carrying you deeper into calm, preparing your mind to wander through time and space. Let your thoughts drift like a quiet stream, moving from one era to the next, from one civilization to another, safe and unhurried. With your body relaxed and your mind open, we are ready to begin, to uncover the stories of those who came before us and the ways humans have sought to understand their past. When we use the word archaeology today, it feels precise. It suggests a discipline with methods, ethics, and a shared vocabulary. The term itself comes from the Greek archaeologia, a compound of archaeos, meaning ancient, and logos, meaning study or account. In classical texts, it didn't refer to digging or scientific investigation. It meant something closer to the telling of ancient stories, an inquiry into origins rather than an excavation of material remains. The modern sense, careful excavation, systematic recording, interpretation rooted in evidence, developed much later. Today, When someone says archaeology, they usually imagine a particular toolkit: stratigraphy, carbon dating, context sheets, trowels tracing layers of soil like sentences on a page. They imagine the past being reconstructed through things, not texts. But this understanding sits on top of a much older set of human behaviors. Long before archaeology became a discipline, people were already engaging with the physical traces of earlier cultures. They didn't call it archaeology, and it didn't resemble the structured work we recognize today. Yet the impulse was there, the sense that buried or ruined things might hold information, and that recovering them could illuminate something about the world. One of the earliest examples appears in Mesopotamia. In the 6th century BC, King Nabonidus ordered excavations at the ruins of ancient temples in Sippar and Ur. His motivations were tied to kingship, religion, and legitimacy, not to scholarship, but the methods he described in inscriptions are striking. He recorded the builders of the temples he unearthed and noted the time spans between dynasties. In one case, he commented on the age of a foundation deposit with a kind of analytical curiosity, the attempt to measure how long ago something had been created. The work was selective and politically shaped, but it shows an early form of historical inquiry grounded in material remains. Egypt offers a different lens. Pharaohs frequently restored monuments built in earlier periods, sometimes faithfully, sometimes with alterations that blended restoration with self-presentation. Ramesses II, for example, repaired structures that were already centuries old and occasionally carved his name over older inscriptions. Later rulers catalogued the achievements of predecessors, not to study them in a modern sense, but to anchor themselves within a lineage of builders. Even if the motivations were ideological, these acts required attention to ancient materials and craftsmanship. They represent a kind of dialogue with the past, conducted through stone. In Greece and the broader Mediterranean, ruins were part of the landscape. By the Classical and Hellenistic periods, earlier Bronze Age structures, Mycenaean tombs, collapsed palaces, enigmatic walls, were still visible but not fully understood. Visitors tried to make sense of them using myths, genealogies, and oral traditions. The travel writer Pausanias, wandering in the 2nd century CE, described tombs, sanctuaries, and ruins with close attention. His accounts mix observation with inherited stories, demonstrating how people interpreted ancient remains long before scientific frameworks existed. His writing doesn't separate material evidence from narrative. The two were intertwined. In China, engagement with antiquity took a different form. Scholars and officials collected ancient bronzes, oracle bones, and inscriptions, treating them as sources for understanding ritual and history. They classified objects, compared motifs, and copied inscriptions to preserve them. Some of these studies were philological rather than physical, but the underlying approach, treating ancient objects as evidence, foreshadows later archaeological thinking. The focus wasn't on excavation, it was on interpretation and verification, using artifacts as anchors for textual traditions. The Near East offers yet another example. In the kingdom of Urartu, rulers sometimes built new structures atop older ones, acknowledging earlier foundations and adapting them to new purposes. Across many regions, construction workers encountered ancient deposits by accident. Sometimes they left inscriptions noting their discoveries. These brief records show that people recognized the existence of earlier layers, literal and figurative, beneath their own. What ties these examples together is not a shared method or a unified worldview, but a recurring behavior, the engagement with material traces from earlier times. The motivations varied: political, religious, practical, symbolic. So did the interpretations. But the act of investigating the past through physical remains was already present in many cultures, long before anyone attempted to standardize it. Equally important is what these early practices lacked. There was no concept of context as archaeologists understand it today, no systematic recording of the position of objects, no recognition that information is lost when a layer is disturbed. Excavation was often incidental or goal-driven, focusing on specific objects rather than the relationships between them. The idea that removing something from the ground could erase information had not yet emerged. Nor had the notion that the past might be studied without subordinating it to the needs of the present. These differences don't imply inferiority or superiority. They simply mark distinct intellectual environments. Early rulers or scholars weren't attempting to be archaeologists in the modern sense. They were navigating the past according to the frameworks available to them. Their efforts reflect the priorities and possibilities of their own worlds. Seen from today's perspective, these early encounters with antiquity form a kind of prehistory of archaeology. Not a straight line leading inevitably to modern practice, but a scattered set of gestures toward the past, some careful, some destructive, many ambiguous. Each example shows people recognizing that the material world contains layers of time and that those layers can be read, even if the method of reading was not yet standardized. These gestures, restoring, collecting, excavating, annotating, didn't create archaeology, but they reveal the long backdrop against which the discipline eventually emerged. Before there were trowels and field schools, there were rulers, scholars, travelers, and builders trying to interpret the remnants of earlier civilizations. Their approaches differed, but they shared a common recognition that what endures in the ground carries information, and that understanding it requires paying attention to what has survived. The earliest encounters with ancient remains were shaped by practical needs, kingship, and religious identity. They weren't attempts to create a discipline. They were attempts to situate the present within a deeper lineage. But as the centuries passed, the relationship between people and the material past changed. Curiosity began to loosen itself from royal agendas and theological frameworks. The past became something individuals could seek out, collect, and interpret on their own terms. This shift didn't happen suddenly. It unfolded gradually, especially in Europe, as older ruins became visible again, sometimes literally, as soil eroded or buildings crumbled, and sometimes intellectually, as classical texts circulated more widely. What emerged wasn't archaeology, but something that would influence it profoundly: the work of the antiquarians. The antiquarian tradition took shape during the late medieval and Renaissance periods. Scholars, nobles, and collectors began to assemble objects from earlier eras: coins, statues, inscriptions, pottery fragments. Some were drawn by aesthetic interest, others wanted physical evidence of histories preserved in manuscripts. The collections varied in size and coherence, ranging from small personal assemblages to elaborate displays filling entire rooms. These were the early cabinets of curiosity, spaces where the natural and the artificial, the ancient and the exotic, were placed side by side without a clear organizing principle. At first glance, these collections can seem unscientific. Objects were often displayed without context or accurate provenance, and classification was inconsistent. But they reveal something important: a growing belief that the past could be understood through things, not just texts. For many antiquarians, the physicality of artifacts made them compelling. Coins carried the names of rulers, statues preserved styles of dress, inscriptions recorded events independent of literary traditions. Material culture began to acquire authority of its own. One of the most influential figures in this transition was the Italian humanist Flavio Biondo. In the 15th century, he described the ruins of Rome in systematic detail, documenting their condition and identifying their original functions. His work didn't involve excavation, but it treated the remnants of antiquity as evidence that could be carefully observed and compared. In this sense, Biondo foreshadowed later methodologies, even though his tools were still textual rather than stratigraphic. By the 16th and 17th centuries, antiquarianism had spread across Europe. Scholars exchanged letters describing newly discovered inscriptions or rare artifacts. Engravers produced drawings of ancient buildings before they collapsed further. Travelers recorded the ruins they saw on voyages through Italy, Greece, and the Eastern Mediterranean, often blending observation with speculation. These records were uneven, some precise, others imaginative, but they reflect a growing effort to document the past visually and materially. The interest in antiquities was not purely academic. It was also shaped by status and competition. Wealthy collectors sought impressive objects to display in their homes, while rulers commissioned expeditions to acquire impressive pieces for palaces and libraries. The value of an artifact often depended on its rarity or perceived connection to famous individuals. In some cases, this demand encouraged forgery. Fake inscriptions, fabricated statues, and artificially aged objects entered collections, blurring the boundary between authentic evidence and artistic invention. Despite these limitations, antiquarian study introduced practices that would later become central to archaeology. Collectors began to classify objects by material, bronze, marble, ceramic, or by motif and inscription. Some compared stylistic changes across time periods. Others attempted early typologies, grouping objects based on shape or ornamentation. These methods were inconsistent, but they marked an emerging interest in chronology and development. The connection between antiquarianism and excavation remained limited. Most antiquarians did not dig, they acquired. When they did excavate, the approach was closer to extraction than investigation. Pits were opened to retrieve statues or inscriptions, not to study layers of occupation. The soil around an artifact was treated as an obstacle rather than information. Context was seldom recorded. Yet these digs, however rudimentary, reveal a growing sense that valuable objects might lie underground, waiting to be found. In some places, this interest intersected with local histories. In Northern Europe, antiquarians studied prehistoric monuments such as burial mounds and standing stones. Lacking written records, they relied on comparison and measurement. Their interpretations were speculative, often linking sites to legendary kings or biblical events, but their surveys created early maps and drawings that remain useful today. Even when their conclusions missed the mark, their documentation preserved information that would otherwise have been lost. One of the most significant transformations brought about by antiquarianism was the gradual shift from viewing the past as a single monolithic era, antiquity, to seeing it as composed of distinct periods, each with its own styles and practices. This layered view of time laid the groundwork for later chronological systems. It also encouraged more systematic comparison. If styles changed, those changes might reflect broader developments in technology, belief, or social organization. By the 18th century, antiquarian societies began to form, most notably the Society of Antiquaries of London. These organizations attempted to standardize the study of ancient objects, encouraging members to document their findings with drawings, measurements, and written descriptions. Their publications circulated across Europe, bringing together observations from different regions. The emphasis remained on objects rather than excavation, but the act of recording became more deliberate. The transition from antiquarianism to archaeology wasn't a clean break. The two overlapped for centuries. Many early archaeologists were trained as antiquarians. They simply adopted new methods as they became available. What distinguishes antiquarianism is its focus on the objects themselves, their beauty, rarity, and ability to illuminate the past, rather than on the contexts that produced them. This focus gave us valuable collections and detailed descriptions, but it also created gaps that later archaeologists had to address. Seen alongside the early examples from Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and China, the rise of the antiquarians marks a distinct moment. the past becomes a matter of individual inquiry. Curiosity expands outward, from rulers and priests to scholars, collectors, and travelers. The questions multiply. So do the interpretations. The work is inconsistent, sometimes speculative, sometimes meticulous, shaped by ambition as much as analysis. But it represents an expanding engagement with ancient material, one that would eventually support the emergence of more systematic methods. Archaeology, as it would later develop, required tools and concepts the antiquarians didn't yet have. But their fascination with objects, how they were made, where they came from, what they represented, set the stage for a new kind of investigation. Before archaeologists looked to the ground for answers, antiquarians taught themselves to look closely at what had already surfaced. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the act of uncovering the past had grown in ambition, scale, and visibility. Antiquarians had collected objects, but their work remained largely confined to cabinets and libraries. Now, the past itself became a field to be explored and often extracted, an undertaking inseparable from empire. Access to ruins, the resources to excavate, and the ability to transport massive artifacts all depended on political power. A defining moment in this shift was the excavation of Herculaneum and Pompeii. In 1738, workmen near the Italian town of Resina struck buried remains of a Roman theatre. Over the following decades, the Bourbon monarchy sponsored gradual excavation of the site, revealing statues, frescoes, and inscriptions preserved by volcanic ash. Documentation was limited by modern standards, but the discoveries captivated Europe, proof that entire urban landscapes could survive, frozen in time, awaiting discovery. Napoleon's Egyptian campaign in 1798 pushed this impulse further. Though the expedition was military, it included engineers, artists, and scholars tasked with recording Egypt's ancient monuments. Their work culminated in the monumental Description de l'Égypte, a vast record of temples, inscriptions, and landscapes. Among their finds was the Rosetta Stone, which would later unlock hieroglyphs, a reminder that scientific progress and imperial ambition were tightly intertwined. Across the Mediterranean, other imperial powers pursued similar projects. British agents and explorers moved through Greece and Ottoman territories, acquiring statues, inscriptions, and architectural fragments. Lord Elgin's removal of sculptures from the Parthenon sparked controversy even then, reflecting a broader assumption. Possession of antiquities conferred cultural prestige on individuals and nations alike. Excavation during this period was inconsistent. Large-scale digs could reveal extraordinary finds, monumental architecture, reliefs, inscriptions, yet methods often prioritized extraction over understanding. Trenches were opened to recover impressive artifacts. Context was treated as expendable. Soil, stratigraphy, and domestic debris, the material that reveals everyday life, were frequently ignored. The tension between spectacle and scholarship was constant. In Egypt, Giovanni Belzoni, a former circus performer turned excavator, documented temple reliefs and removed colossal statues with engineering ingenuity, if not subtlety. His work was destructive by modern standards, yet it revealed the monumental scale of ancient Egyptian architecture and inspired broader European interest. Similarly, European scholars working in Mesopotamia, such as Austin Henry Layard, excavated Nimrud and Nineveh, uncovering the winged guardian figures, palace reliefs, and the library of Ashurbanipal. These discoveries demonstrated that entire civilizations could be revealed, not just isolated artifacts. Museums in London, Paris, and elsewhere would soon house these finds, shaping European understandings of the ancient Near East. The rediscovery of Pompeii and Herculaneum added another dimension. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, where monumental art dominated excavation, Pompeii preserved ordinary life, streets, kitchens, graffiti, homes. Visitors encountered daily routines frozen in time, highlighting that the everyday could be as revealing as the monumental. This raised a central challenge. Understanding the past required attention to domestic spaces, not just temples and palaces. Across all imperial excavations, interpretation was shaped by the politics of the era. European powers crafted narratives that emphasized monumental art, royal inscriptions, and elite culture. Aspects aligned with their own ideals of civilization and empire. Ordinary objects and local traditions often went unrecorded, and the past was filtered through contemporary cultural priorities. At the same time, these excavations prompted important methodological developments. The sheer volume of material forced scholars to consider organization, documentation, and preservation. Detailed sketches, plans, and written records began to accompany the objects themselves. In Pompeii, careful mapping of streets and houses hinted at the systematic recording practices that would later become standard. In Egypt and Mesopotamia, copies of inscriptions and measured drawings preserved information that might otherwise have been lost to damage or removal. These efforts revealed a crucial insight. Context mattered just as much as the objects recovered. The combined impact of imperial excavation and the rediscovery of lost cities transformed Europe's engagement with antiquity. Ancient civilizations became tangible and accessible, their scale and complexity laid bare. Yet much information was still lost or misinterpreted, and the stories constructed often reflected the priorities of those wielding power. By the end of the 19th century, the stage was set for the next shift. The work of empire had revealed the richness of the ancient world, but also the cost of poor methods. Scholars now recognized that the ground itself, with its layers and sequences, held irreplaceable information. This realization paved the way for scientific excavation and the methodological rigor of Thompson, Pitt Rivers, Wheeler, and the formalization of stratigraphy. By the mid-19th century, archaeology was poised at a crossroads. For centuries, the discipline had been shaped by curiosity, collection, and imperial ambition. Antiquarians had gathered objects. Explorers had unearthed entire cities. Yet much of this work had been fragmentary, uneven, and heavily influenced by the priorities of those funding or directing the excavations. Statues were prized over shards of pottery. Monumental architecture was studied, while ordinary homes or trash pits were overlooked. The question that emerged, whether implicitly or explicitly, was how to move beyond spectacle and treasure towards systematic understanding. The first attempts at method began in Europe, often rooted in a desire to impose order on the overwhelming complexity of the past. One of the earliest frameworks emerged from Denmark in the 1830s, the three-age system proposed by Christian Jørgensen Thomsen. Thomsen, curator of the Royal Danish Museum, had been tasked with arranging the museum's collection of prehistoric artifacts. Confronted with thousands of objects spanning centuries, stone tools, bronze implements, iron weapons, he sought a rational method to organize them. Thomsen's solution was deceptively simple. He divided prehistory into three successive ages: stone, bronze, and iron. The sequence was chronological. Societies had begun with stone tools, progressed to bronze, and finally adopted iron. Thomsen's approach relied on observable differences in material and craftsmanship, but it also assumed a progression of technological sophistication. The three-age system was not perfect. It reflected the intellectual assumptions of its time. Yet it established a framework for thinking about cultural change over time, rather than focusing solely on isolated objects. In parallel with Thomsen's work, other scholars began applying more systematic excavation techniques. Sir Augustus Pitt Rivers, working in England during the late 19th century, emphasized careful recording and documentation. Unlike earlier excavators who sought only impressive artifacts, Pitt Rivers insisted on collecting and cataloguing every find, from monumental sculptures to fragments of pottery, from arrowheads to domestic debris. He meticulously measured the position of each object within a site, understanding that context, where something was found and how it related to its surroundings, could be as informative as the object itself. Pitt Rivers' approach reflected a growing awareness that the ground itself was evidence. Layers of soil, discarded objects, and architectural remains formed sequences that, if carefully observed, could reveal patterns of human activity. His work marked a turning point in excavation practice. The act of digging was no longer solely about acquisition. It was about recording relationships, sequences, and processes. In Scandinavia, Thomsen's three-age system inspired fieldwork that sought to apply relative dating to objects in their archaeological context. By comparing the style and material of artifacts found in successive layers, researchers could infer chronological relationships even when absolute dates were unknown. This method relied on careful observation and comparison rather than speculation, and it laid the foundation for later developments in stratigraphy. Stratigraphy itself became a central principle in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The work of pioneers like Mortimer Wheeler in England refined excavation methods further. Wheeler developed the grid system, a way of dividing a site into squares to control and record precisely where each artifact was found. By exposing successive layers carefully, archaeologists could reconstruct the sequence of human activity on a site. Stratigraphy revealed that objects removed from their layers lost much of their informational value. Context mattered as much as the object itself. The impact of these methodological developments extended beyond Europe. Excavators in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Mediterranean began to adopt more systematic approaches, even as large-scale imperial expeditions continued. The tension between the desire for spectacular finds and the emerging discipline of careful excavation persisted, but methodological advances provided tools for balancing these impulses. The shift was gradual, uneven, and often contested, yet it fundamentally changed what archaeology could accomplish. By the turn of the 20th century, these practices had established a new standard. Archaeologists were no longer simply digging for impressive objects or documenting monumental architecture. They were tracing human activity through time, reconstructing sequences and interpreting patterns across entire sites. Objects were important, but they were no longer considered meaningful in isolation. A fragment of pottery or a discarded tool could tell a story about production, trade, or domestic life if its context was preserved and understood. This transformation in method also allowed archaeology to engage with questions of social and technological change. Where earlier work had emphasized kings, temples, and monuments, systematic excavation could reveal ordinary life, craft production, and settlement patterns. The three-age system provided a framework for ordering artifacts. Pitt River's insistence on comprehensive collection ensured that the smallest objects were recorded. Stratigraphy allowed archaeologists to place finds within sequences of occupation. Together, these innovations bridged the gap between curiosity-driven exploration and scientific investigation. By formalizing method, archaeology began to articulate a core principle that endures today. The past can be approached systematically, measured through evidence, and reconstructed from the relationships between objects, layers, and spaces. These principles did not erase the influence of empire, politics, or personal ambition, but they introduced tools for mitigating those effects. The act of digging, once primarily an exercise in acquisition, had become an exercise in observation, recording, and analysis. With more rigorous excavation techniques in place, the material record could be read with increasing precision. But texts, inscriptions, and symbols still required interpretation. Just as stratigraphy allowed archaeologists to read the layers of the ground, breakthroughs in linguistics and epigraphy would allow them to read the layers of human thought and communication, revealing histories that had remained silent for millennia. By the late 19th century, excavation had become increasingly systematic. Archaeologists no longer relied solely on treasure hunting or the spectacle of monumental ruins. They were learning to record, measure, and interpret the ground itself. Objects could be catalogued, layers documented, and sequences reconstructed. Yet material remains, no matter how carefully excavated, told only part of the story. Understanding the people behind those objects required something more. Language. Few breakthroughs in archaeology have had the transformative effect of deciphering the written word. Inscriptions, once mysterious, suddenly became windows into thought, culture, and governance. Texts could reveal laws, religious practices, trade, diplomacy, even everyday life, that artifacts alone could only hint at. Decoding lost languages reshaped not only archaeology but also history, politics, and national identity. The most famous of these breakthroughs came from Egypt. In 1799, during Napoleon's campaign, French soldiers were working near the town of Rosetta in the Nile Delta when they uncovered a black granite slab. The stone bore inscriptions in 3 different scripts: Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphs. At first, the significance of the find was not fully appreciated. The Greek inscription could be read, and scholars quickly recognized that it was a decree affirming the authority of Pharaoh Ptolemy V. By comparison, the Demotic and hieroglyphic scripts were mysterious. The Rosetta Stone became the prize of both scholarship and politics. When the British defeated the French in Egypt in 1801, the stone was taken as a spoil of war and shipped to London, where it remains today. Its journey reflects a broader theme of archaeology at the time. Discoveries were entangled with imperial power, national prestige, and the movement of cultural property. Yet even in its new home, the stone offered a puzzle that demanded resolution. The breakthrough came with the work of Jean-François Champollion, a French scholar deeply versed in Coptic. By 1822, after years of study and comparison, Champollion realized that hieroglyphs were not purely symbolic. They could represent both sounds and ideas. Some characters stood for consonantal sounds, much like letters in an alphabet, while others conveyed meaning ideographically. This insight allowed Champollion to begin reading names, titles, and even complex texts in a script that had been silent for more than a millennium. Champollion's achievement did not emerge in isolation. Scholars across Europe had been attempting to make sense of hieroglyphs using comparative methods and drawing on the Greek portion of the Rosetta Stone. Yet Champollion's grasp of Coptic gave him a decisive advantage. He could connect spoken forms to written symbols, demonstrating patterns in the writing that others had missed. His work revealed that Egyptian civilization could now be read directly, rather than inferred from external accounts or material remains alone. The significance of this breakthrough extended far beyond the Rosetta Stone. For the first time, scholars could situate artifacts within historical, political, and religious contexts with precision. Pharaohs could be identified and sequenced. Temple inscriptions could be understood as records of ritual and governance. Tombs could reveal genealogies, titles, and political negotiation. In short, the ancient world could speak for itself, provided archaeologists had the tools to listen. Meanwhile, in Mesopotamia, another monumental challenge awaited. Thousands of clay tablets recovered from sites such as Nineveh and Nimrud bore cuneiform inscriptions. The script had evolved over centuries, and deciphering it required linguistic skill, patience, and comparative analysis. Henry Rawlinson, a British officer and scholar, took on this task with determination. His focus was the Behistun inscription, carved into a cliff in what is now western Iran. The text was trilingual: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, much like the Rosetta Stone. By painstakingly copying and comparing the inscriptions, Rawlinson unlocked the Old Persian cuneiform system and began reading earlier Mesopotamian languages. Deciphering cuneiform opened an extraordinary window into early urban life. Tablets revealed royal decrees, trade records, contracts, letters, and administrative lists, tracing social, economic, and political networks across centuries. The texts transformed archaeology from a pursuit of objects to a study of systems: how cities were governed, how empires maintained control, and how ordinary people navigated these structures. Decipherment transformed the interpretation of artifacts across regions. Objects that might have seemed purely decorative or ceremonial could now be understood in context. A tablet could explain the production or exchange of goods. A tomb inscription could illuminate religious practices. An official record could reveal social hierarchies. Texts and material culture began to complement each other, each amplifying the significance of the other. Archaeology was no longer merely about seeing the past. It was about reading it. The intellectual and political impact of decipherment was profound. Champollion and Rawlinson's work intersected with national narratives and scholarly prestige. European nations positioned themselves as the custodians of knowledge, and access to texts became a symbol of intellectual and cultural authority. Control over knowledge, like control over artifacts, was intertwined with power. Decipherment also challenged long-held assumptions. Societies once imagined as static or peripheral revealed complexity, innovation, and administration that could be read directly from their records. The story of the Rosetta Stone itself reflects both the promise and the challenges of this period. Its inscriptions connected multiple linguistic traditions, but its journey illustrates how political and military power shaped access to knowledge. Scholars could study it, yes, but only within the context of empire. Its physical presence was inseparable from the historical and cultural frameworks imposed by the modern world. Decipherment also highlighted the limitations of earlier archaeology. For centuries, Egypt and Mesopotamia had been interpreted through classical texts, biblical narratives, or European assumptions. Textual evidence corrected, confirmed, or complicated these interpretations, revealing histories that material remains alone could not fully convey. Hieroglyphs and cuneiform allowed archaeologists to see beyond monumental objects and into administrative systems, literary traditions, and lived experiences. By the mid-19th century, a broader principle emerged. Material culture and written records are inseparable. Excavated objects gain meaning through context, sequence, and, when available, inscription. Conversely, texts lose clarity without an understanding of the physical environment in which they were created. Stratigraphy, typology, and careful recording provided the tools to preserve and interpret these contexts. Deciphered languages allowed archaeologists to read those contexts with precision. Together, method and text transformed archaeology into a discipline capable of reconstructing the past in both space and time. In short, the story of the Rosetta Stone, along with the decipherment of cuneiform, represents a turning point. Civilizations could now communicate across millennia, offering insight into governance, belief, trade, and daily life. Texts did not replace objects, but they transformed them into carriers of information, connecting human activity to specific moments in history. Archaeology had moved into a new phase, one in which the written word and material evidence together enabled a far richer understanding of the ancient world than either could provide alone. As our first episode comes to a close, we can look back on the path that brought archaeology to life as a discipline. From the earliest stirrings of curiosity in ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, and Greece, humans have sought to understand their past, sometimes preserving it, sometimes reshaping it in memory. Renaissance collectors and antiquarians brought objects into cabinets and galleries, revealing glimpses of civilizations long gone, though often without the context that would make them fully intelligible. Imperial expeditions expanded this quest across continents, uncovering lost cities and monumental architecture while intertwining discoveries with power, prestige, and politics. The work of explorers like Giovanni Belzoni reminds us that archaeology has always been a human endeavour, daring, flawed, ambitious, and occasionally spectacular. Yet it was the recognition that context matters, the careful recording of layers, the attention to everyday objects that marked the turning point towards systematic, methodical excavation. And then came language. The inscriptions of Egypt and Mesopotamia, once indecipherable, found interpreters in scholars like Champollion and Rawlinson. Through their work, the past began to speak in words, not just in stone and clay. Civilization, administration, religion, and daily life could be read directly from the evidence, bridging millennia in ways that treasure alone never could. Objects gained meaning, texts gained life. Together, they opened a window into human history that continues to expand with every excavation, every discovery, and every careful study. In this episode, we have traced the roots of archaeology, showing how curiosity, collection, empire, and method converge to create the tools and approaches that allow us to understand the human past. As we pause here, the story of archaeology is far from complete. In the next episode, we will travel beyond the familiar cities of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Mediterranean. We will follow explorers and scholars as they uncover ancient settlements across the Americas, Africa, and Asia. We will see how archaeology became not just a pursuit of monuments, but a science capable of measuring time itself, tracing migrations, and reconstructing the lives of ordinary people. New tools, new methods, and new discoveries await, from careful excavation grids to the earliest forms of scientific dating, from monumental finds to the tiniest fragments that reveal entire histories. The past stretches across continents and centuries, and in episode 2, we will continue listening to the stories it has to tell. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the beginnings of archaeology. I hope to see you back soon. Until then, good night.